All right, everybody, it's 10:02, so we're going to get started. If you just joined us, please go ahead and drop your name, where you're joining us from, and your favorite thing to let computers do for you in the chat. Welcome and good morning and afternoon for those of us joining us from the East Coast or elsewhere. Thank you so much for joining us today. We welcome you to another installment of Code for America's Find Your Summit series. This series brings the spirit of Summit to you wherever you are all year round. My name is Francesca, and I will just give you a few housekeeping introduction reminders before we jump into the content. All attendees are muted, but you're encouraged to use the chat function. We ask that you submit questions for our panelists by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We'll answer as many questions as we can throughout and in the Q&A session at the end. For those of you on social media, we encourage you to participate by tagging #CFA Summit. And then a reminder to please keep Code for America's Code of Conduct in mind so we can maintain a respectful environment for all. And my colleague will be dropping the Code of Conduct in the chat. And all right, let's go ahead and get started. Next slide. So again, my name is Francesca Costa. I use she, her pronouns. I am the Director of Food Assistance here at Code for America, and I'm joined by my colleague, Ryan Hatch.
Hi, everyone. Great to be here. Thank you all for spending some of your day with us.
So if you don't know about us, we are Code for America. We're a 501c3 nonprofit, and our goal is to couple technology with human-centered design to improve government services, working with government partners to reduce poverty and advance equity. Next slide. At Code for America, we believe, again, the two biggest levers for improving people's lives at scale are technology and government. There are 37 million people in poverty for myriad reasons, and we believe government programs are the most effective anti-poverty tools we have at the national level. Yet billions of dollars fail to reach people every year because of outdated, hard-to-use systems. Next slide. So SNAP, for those of you who are less familiar, is formerly known as food stamps. Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program is the acronym, and it basically adds money to low-income households' food budgets. So along with school meals, it lifted 3.2 million people above the poverty line in 2020. The program serves 41 people nationwide, so that's 1 in 8 people in the US receive the benefits. SNAP recipients get money for food on an EBT card, which works just like a debit card, but benefits are pretty modest. They average $6.10 per person per day. The long-term benefits are well documented, improved educational, health, and economic outcomes. Another thing to note is that 2/3 of SNAP participants are in families with children, and over 1/3 are in households with older adults or people with disabilities. Next slide. So here at Code for America, we focus on SNAP and social safety net benefits, and our long-term vision is that they're just easy to use, that there are no people having to facilitate the process, that people get the right information at the right time. Something like getting a text message that just lets you know what your next steps are, something that we're really used to using and getting from technology in the digital age. Next slide. So to do this, we started a 7-year initiative called the Safety Net Innovation Lab. We'll be working with 15 jurisdictions over 7 years to serve 13 million people and unlock $30 billion in benefits that otherwise would go unused. Next slide. And so in order to do this, we launched our first cohort of state partners. Today, we're going to be focusing on our work in California, which predates the Innovation Lab. So we'll be threading together a little bit of our direct service work over the years and how we're leveraging this direct service work to support systems in being better and really serve people for the long term. Next slide. And I'm going to hand this over to Ryan.
Awesome. Thank you, Francesca. So I think one of the points that Francesca made really clear is that SNAP is such an effective tool for fighting poverty in this country and getting money and food in the hands of families who really need it. And that's what we're all about. On the California team here at Code for America, we work on a product called GetCalFresh. I'm the senior product manager, and GetCalFresh is really set up to achieve a world where there's full and equitable participation in SNAP programs in California. And we do that by making it as easy as possible to apply for and renew benefits. SNAP has its own branding in California. It's CalFresh, so that's where the name comes from. But you see a screenshot of our homepage here. GetCalFresh is a digital SNAP application assister. If you want to check us out, you can check it out on demo.getcalfresh.org. We have a mobile-first design. It's available on any device with an internet, and we've managed to take that SNAP application and get it down to a 12-minute application time, which makes it really easy to apply for benefits when you need them. The application is fully translated into English, Spanish, and traditional Chinese. And we also provide live client support via email, text, and chat. There's a little chat button in the top of the screen there that's available throughout the application. So anytime you get stuck, you can reach out to our incredible client success team, who's going to help you navigate your issue and answer important questions about the process. Throughout the process of running GetCalFresh, we collect data and insights into client needs that we share with our partners so that we can work together to learn about and improve the CalFresh application process altogether. On the next slide, I'll talk a little bit more about why we built it. So we really built GetCalFresh because it's hard to apply for the program. Legacy systems created barriers for clients in need. So you can see a GIF here of one of the existing applications. It has 51 pages, over 200 questions. So it can be a process that ends up taking a lot of time and can also use challenging language that makes it hard for clients to make it through the process. On the next slide, I can talk a little bit about our approach and how we try to approach this problem using human-centered design. So GetCalFresh started as really just a PDF form. Started with a couple of conversations with clients and caseworkers in San Francisco to understand what their needs were. Started as that really simple kind of Google form, and we've applied this human-centered design process to iterate on every inch of the client journey. So we start by having conversations with clients and building things based on those conversations that we think will address important problems. Then we give it to people to use and observe how they kind of navigate that system. And we identify challenges and pain points that we learn from and improve. And so it's this constant loop of building, understanding how people are interacting with that thing you've built and iterating on that approach to find something that works. And it's been an approach that's got us a lot of success. On the next slide, I can talk a little bit about how human-centered design has helped us achieve outcomes for a lot of people. So since 2020, GetCalFresh has helped over 10 million people. We've helped them apply for benefits, submit renewals at their 6-month mark, submit documents to support their case. And that's all by really listening deeply and practicing a really healthy curiosity about what clients' needs and pain points are. And I'll pass it over to Francesca, who will center the client voice.
Thank you, Ryan. So the proof that this is actually working, of course, is in the feedback that you get from the users, clients, and caseworkers, and the outcomes that people experience. I'm going to read some of our client quotes and also some worker quotes throughout today. This client said, GetCalFresh is actually really fast. I thought it would be complicated with all the questions and long. It was straight to the point. It took me 10 minutes. Even with 2 babies, I was able to do it within that time. So today, GetCalFresh assists 80% of online applications statewide, but we're working to replicate this in the system long-term. Next slide. So today, one thing that we might reference throughout is an iteration cycle. And basically that means like a period of time where we're pushing through changes to improve the process. So we're going to be talking about how we, break down complex policy problems for clients who are applying through GetCalFresh to get benefits. But we recommend that you think throughout just how this human-centered design approach can be applied to any problems that you see in your day-to-day. So for us, we start with user needs. We leverage digital services to make those user needs possible to achieve. And then we try to influence operations and policy for those things that we can't fix with just user-centered design and technology. So there's a whole long process here. It's really generational work. This is incremental change in action, moving towards solving the most important problems with every iteration cycle. Next slide. And so one thing we really want to make clear today is that the policy rules complicate the application process, but these burdens are not equally distributed. So rules can be particularly complicated for some different populations. We're going to focus on a few today: students, non-English speakers, and working age adults without dependents. This leads to lower participation for these groups. One other thing to know about the environment that we're working in is that there are overlapping state and local administration dynamics that make complex policies even more complicated. So we have things happening at the federal level, at the state level, and in California at the county level. So in 10 states, administrations at the county level, and the state supports the counties in administering the program. Next slide. So like I mentioned, we're going to walk through 3 case studies to show how we put this framework to work. We're going to talk about expedited service recommendations, student eligibility rules, and something called ABOD screening. If you don't know what ABOD means, that's completely fine. In fact, expected. We're going to be working through some pretty wonky details today, given that the idea is to break down complex policy. ABOD stands for able-bodied adults without dependents, and we're going to get into what all that means. So if you understand 80% of what this slide says, it's totally fine. You're in the right place. I'm going to hand it over to Ryan for case study number 1.
Awesome. Thank you, Francesca. So I'm excited to dive into case study 1. Case study 1 is all about how we work with clients to provide expedited service recommendations to the county. And on the next slide, I'll talk a little bit more about what those are. So expedited service is a set of policies where clients with really acute food need can qualify for really quick processing of their applications. So federal rules give states 7 days to process applicants and applications that qualify for expedited service. In California, the threshold's a little quicker. It's 3 days. So workers in counties have 3 days to process expedited applications in California. To qualify, applicants must meet strict income and resource criteria. We'll get into what those criteria are exactly in a little bit. On this slide, you can see sort of on the right here, a screenshot of one page and one of the application forms called the SAWS 2+. And you can see a little red box around the 3 expedited service questions that help a worker determine if you're eligible for this quicker, faster service based on your acute food need. Clients have to answer these questions in the midst of a really detailed 29-page application form. And so this is just one chunk of many questions and information that clients must provide in order to submit an application. On the next slide, I'll talk specifically about what those strict income and resource criteria are. So in order to qualify for expedited service, clients need to answer yes to one of these 3 questions. Those are the 3 things that were in that red box, just kind of blown up so you can actually read them now. Just to pick one, for example, is your household's combined gross income and liquid resources less than the combined rent and mortgage and utilities? So clients have to answer pretty complicated questions like this that ask for detailed information and kind of complicated comparisons between their expenses, their income, their cash on hand and in the bank. So I'd like to invite you all to try and answer these questions for your own household. Let us know in the chat, how easy or difficult are they to answer as you kind of go through them and think of them on your own. On the next slide, I can talk a little bit about how we try to simplify some of this. You can see pretty complicated words like gross income, liquid resources. Great point in the chat. Thank you. Looked at the chat and thank you all for these answers. So you can see it's pretty complicated to answer. These are really kind of gnarly questions and sentences to parse apart. And so we didn't want to ask them as they directly appear on the form. And so instead we ask clients to report the money they have on hand. We ask them for how much cash or money they have sort of on themselves or in checking or savings accounts. This way, clients could kind of provide a hopefully simpler question to answer. How much money do you have on cash and in the bank, instead of those really complicated ones that we saw on the previous slide. And we already have to ask clients to provide their income and expense information so then we can compare all these 3 numbers to get an expedited service recommendation to county partners. So we did try to simplify it a little bit, but on the next slide, I can talk about even this version of the question still had problems for clients. It still caused a couple of pretty important issues that made it hard for clients to make it through these particular questions. First, it created a lot of fear and anxiety. Clients told us that they were really worried that if they shared this information honestly and accurately, that it would mean they don't qualify for benefits. Now, there is no resource requirement in California. It would not count against them. And we did have copy and wording on the page to let clients know that, but still we heard that fear come up again and again. They also have a really high cognitive load to answer accurately. Thank you all for sharing your thoughts in the chat. They're really kind of challenging questions to get an exact number. One thing you'll hear again if you do a lot of research in this space is that clients are really worried about accuracy. They don't want county workers to think that they're trying to take advantage of government programs, and so they really put a lot of effort into reflecting their situation as holistically as possible, but it can be really challenging with complicated questions like this. And so this page was one of our highest sources of drop-off. Lots of people fell off on this page in the application. And this was particularly true for non-English speakers. So the drop-offs at this page were significantly higher for folks who completed their application in Spanish or Chinese, which contributed to a really deep participation gap that's driven by language access in SNAP and in CalFresh in particular. So still a lot of challenges with just asking, how much money do you have on hand? On the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about how we tried to simplify this complex policy around expedited service even further for clients. So this is one really great example where we had computers do the work. We hypothesized that a yes or no question would be easier to answer than an open-ended one where we just ask for a dollar value. And like I said before, we already had some income and expense information from clients. So we used that income and expense information, compared it to the resource thresholds that are written into the CalFresh policy, and calculated a number based on all of those inputs. This way, we were able to skip the question for clients who definitely did not qualify for expedited service based on their income. And we were able to ask a targeted, tailored question for clients who we thought could potentially qualify. So you'll see two examples here on the left. Depending on if your housing expenses were greater than your income, we asked that first version of the question. There's sort of a complicated equation there, but what it would end up looking for the end user would be, does your household have less than $64 in cash in the bank, for example? And so clients would say yes or no, and we would explain a little bit about how we came up with that number. So this way we could take away all this complicated math from the client, have computers do it, they're super good at it, and simplify the process for everyone. And on the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about the benefits we saw with this approach for clients. So this new version, where we asked that as a yes or no question, made a lot more clients made it through the flow. We anticipated about 8,600 people completed applications in the 6 months after we launched the change than would have in the prior 6 months if we had stuck with that old open-ended version. And you can see here the drop-off percentages before and after the change. For all users, it was about 2.09%. It went down to 0.96%, but you see the reduction in drop-offs really dramatically driven by that language access and equity component as well. So for Chinese and Spanish applicants, the drop-offs after the change were much, much lower than they were before the change, which was really great to see. So that new version meant a lot more clients made it through the flow. And on the next slide, we can also talk about how it helped out county workers as well. Now that we had more clients getting through the flow, we had a lot of information about their income, expenses, and liquid resources. We were able to iterate and work with our county partners to provide an expedited service recommendation to show our work, so we could illustrate the numbers and questions that got us to that expedited service recommendation and ensure the county staff had everything they needed to quickly screen expedited service applicants with confidence. So you have a quote here from the Deputy Branch Director in Yolo County, a really great partner of ours. And one thing I'll call out from this quote, it's minimize the need to contact applicants with follow-up questions and improve referral accuracy. So you can see how we also made things simpler for our partners at the county working offices who are really have really huge workloads. So it was really great to also be able to help them out with speed and accuracy here through these changes. That's it for case study 1. Thank you so much for listening. Passing it back to Francesca for the next one.
Thank you so much, Ryan. So up next, we're going to go through case study number 2, which is for student eligibility rules. You can go ahead and go to the next slide. So just to kind of level set, I'm going to give you a little bit of like the tip of the iceberg on student rules because they're so complicated. The origin is in the 1970s. Congress adopted restrictions to student access in SNAP with the idea that students had familial support, were a relatively privileged group, and didn't need aid. Of course, we know that students today don't necessarily fit that profile, are often mired with lots of expenses of attending school. As of 2016, nearly 1 in 3 college students came from low-income households, increasing from 21% 20 years ago. And kind of what that all ladders up to is that only 31% of eligible college students receive SNAP benefits. This is a huge loss, for people. So we wanted to make this as simple as possible. And working with students is one of our first populations that we really took a deep dive into way back when. Next slide. So just to give you a little bit of a sense, this is a website put together by Legal Services in Northern California. This is our go-to policy guidance. It really simplifies policy and puts it in plain language for us to begin to understand it. So just to give you a sense, this is the bulk of the student rules that folks have to navigate, even when it's a pared down set of information. Next slide. Really, the way that it works is that college students are ineligible until proven otherwise. I have a quote here from a client who said, I was accepted to a graduate student program, but have not started classes and have not enrolled in any classes as of yet. The registration doesn't open until late September. I don't know if I'm still considered a student or not with this situation. And this student went on to give us, all of his bills or all of their bills that they had paid and like they were expecting to pay to really qualify like why they were eligible for CalFresh. And this is something we see a lot that I think just shows kind of like the feeling that people have when they apply. There's obviously a lot of stigma and shame still associated with the program. The other thing that I think this tells us is like, they feel like they have to be experts in these policies. They've internalized that being a student is a bad thing, not something that we want to celebrate and support as a society. Of course, this compounds the stigma and shame associated with accessing CalFresh benefits and the fear of adverse consequences, especially if they get something wrong when they're sharing the information in their application, deterring them from applying and participating in the program. Next slide. So we put together a website. This is one of our first landing pages. It's actually from 2017, really aimed to just, make people feel better about applying, let them know that it was just like another form of financial aid, letting them know that essentially it's a free debit card for groceries, that 2 in 5 students are eligible. And throughout this page, we answer some questions, how much will you get? What does this mean? How long should it take? Recognizing that like, hey, we know you feel like you should be studying. This will just take a couple minutes of your time. If you're approved, you'll get money within 30 days. Really letting them know that starving is not a requirement. Next slide. And so when we set out to make this process easier for folks, we want to use a couple of user-centered design concepts. Gating questions and skip logic are 2 of the big ones here. And so in our initial screener, we ask people, are you a college student? If they say yes, then that means that we'll ungate a series of questions later in the application. And if they say no, then they don't see those questions at all. So really that is what allows us to keep the time to apply much lower, because you're only really seeing information about your specific situation. And this is something that technology allows us to do that a paper form would not. So you'll see these are kind of the follow-up questions that we have if somebody is a student. Next slide. So we distill these policies, again, into the most important questions. And the goal is to get eligible students approved. So really over time, we've added things that we've learned from workers are really crucial pieces of information that they need to quickly assess whether or not a student might be eligible. And of course, all of this can be done from a mobile phone. Next slide. Really trying to make the process with as little friction as possible. And we're never done. We continually iterate. So this is actually one of the cool new things we've developed, where basically you can type any version of your college campus into a dropdown and we'll find it for you. So if you say UC Berkeley or you say University of California at Berkeley, the different options will pop up and you can select it. This was also feedback from community-based organizations, which we refer to as CBOs, who were saying that it was really hard for them to track the data on the back end of who, was applying and which college campuses were reaching folks and where we still needed to put in more effort. So this constant iteration is never done. The other thing on the right was something that we added a few years ago, really thinking about, based on a student situation, what are the things that an eligibility worker is going to need from the student to figure out if they might qualify. And so we ask folks to submit their class schedule and proof of the exemption that made them potentially eligible. Next slide. And like we mentioned, the goal is really systems change. So we're not just trying to do this ourselves. We want to support the new application of record. It's called Benefits Cal. It's really such a cut above what we've had historically. And so they developed a beautiful student-centered page that also has FAQs, and we're really proud of the work that they've done there. And next slide. So just a couple of takeaways here from this student work. Technology allows us to create a tailored experience. Again, it's something that you can't do on a paper form to really make sure that folks are really only seeing stuff that's applicable to them. We use that question gating and then also skip logic. So figuring out, should they see the follow-up question or not, to make the student application experience, as quick and easy as possible while still getting the most important information over to workers. Simple and clear is best. We agonize over the words we put on our website, kind of argue about what's clear. We aim for fourth grade reading level or lower. We try to always avoid jargon, and we read copy aloud to make sure it's simple. We also use a really great website called the Hemingway app. My colleague Annalise, I believe, can drop this in chat for you, so you can check it out yourself. It's super easy to use. You just plop whatever text you're working on in there, and it will tell you what reading level it is, and it'll highlight any problem areas that you may want to clarify. And then third, continually iterate based on worker, community-based organization, and client feedback. We're never done. We're always learning more about pain points that we can resolve. And then again, trying to offer those learnings up to the system to inform long-term change. And the next slide. That said, I think it's really important to understand that there are limits with what you can do with policy. So it's really important to advocate for better policy. This client said, the application process was easier and faster than expected, but the qualifications suck. I'm a full-time student taking 15 units, and since I'm not working at least 20 hours a week and only getting 18 hours, I don't qualify. It doesn't make sense to me. And I'll just say, it doesn't make sense to us either. So we really want to advocate for better policy alongside this intervention work. And I'm going to go ahead and move on to case study number 3, if everyone can take a breath, because this is the heaviest one of the day. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So maybe you can relate right now, understanding what is ABOD. This was talking to a client in San Francisco. What are you asking me? Oh, I could lose my CalFresh. I would be trying to figure out, what is that? ABAWD, what is that word? So what does ABOD mean anyway? So ABOD is maybe my least favorite acronym of all the acronyms that exist, which are a lot. That stands for able-bodied adults without dependents. So under the Clinton administration, Congress introduced the ABOD time limit to SNAP rules as part of welfare reform in 1996. And I'll break all this down, but basically this is something we've been working with since 1996. And welfare reform actually had a massive impact on SNAP policy. A lot of different public benefits policy that you can still see really shaped what we see today. So the ABOD rules, kind of the long and short of it, is that they are a combination of work requirements and benefit time limits. But really, next slide. Really, it's about whether or not you can prove you're working. So these rules apply to people who are between 18 and 49 years old, who don't have disabilities and don't have dependents. Unless you're exempt from the rules or can prove you work 20 hours a week, you can only get SNAP benefits for 3 months in a 3-year period. It's really important to name that SNAP's time limit is deeply rooted in racialized stereotypes about public benefits recipients and disproportionately takes benefits away from Black and Latinx participants. One other thing to note is that this is getting totally into wonky town, so feel free to ignore, but areas with high unemployment can qualify for waivers, and that we've seen that a lot throughout the years. The rules were waived nationally for several years through the Great Recession and throughout the COVID public health emergency. So we actually haven't had to implement these in years. I'll talk a little bit about our process there. It's also really important to note that rigorous evidence shows that SNAP's time limit kicks people off benefits without increasing employment. And that is like something we'll repeat several times because it's really important to know there's no proof that they help people find work. What these rules are really effective at is kicking people off of benefits. So next slide. So, you might be thinking like, okay, well, you're between 18 and 49, you don't have kids, you're not disabled, like maybe it's not so bad. But these folks really, if you actually dive a little bit more deeply into the data, are generally extremely marginalized and have very low incomes. So childless adults receiving SNAP have very low incomes. Approximately 70% are below half of the poverty line. According to the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, our really good friends, we refer to them as CBPP, the average income for people affected by this rule is just 18% of the poverty line. So really, really low numbers in terms of income. Most people without children who receive SNAP don't qualify for other kinds of assistance. And the unemployment rate is double to triple the average rate for people without a college degree or high school diploma. So really, when you drill down into it, folks who are really vulnerable. Next slide. Also important to note that most people who can work do. So close to 3/4 of childless adults work within 12 months before or after receiving SNAP. And what we've learned is that the ABOD rules disproportionately screen out folks experiencing homelessness. And kind of the long and short of it here is that it's not just that you have to be working, it's that you have to constantly prove that you're working, or it's not that you have to prove that you're exempt. You have to go through these processes that we refer to as administrative burden to keep your benefits. One study found that many face one or more barriers that can make finding and keeping jobs challenging. So a lot of folks subject to this rule have unstable living situations, may have some mental or physical health conditions that make it hard to work, or don't have transportation. So again, just to really drill this home, next slide. If the goal is helping people find meaningful employment, work requirements don't work. Again, what they really do is kick people off of benefits. I'm going to go through a couple of just like case studies that we found outside in the world that prove this. So next slide. So a recent publication called Employed in a Snap, the impact of work requirements on program participation and labor supply, found that work requirements increased program exits by 64% within an 18-month period. So there's a 53% overall reduction in program participation for people who are subject to this rule, and homeless adults, again, are disproportionately screened out. And they found no effects on employment. So basically all of this work on the county side to verify these things for people to prove that they're working or prove that they're exempt with no actual outcomes for the stated purpose. Next slide. Furthermore, a recent study that was written up in Science Daily found that being exposed to work requirements in order to receive food stamps from the US government significantly increased the use of mental health care resources for depression and anxiety. So essentially, the study found that being exposed to work requirements made depression and anxiety worse among folks who lived in pilot counties where they were studying this. Work requirements increased visits for depression and anxiety by 26% and 12% respectively for women. Visits also increased for men, but more slowly than for women. So this study adds to a growing body of recent evidence that SNAP requirements don't improve employment rates, their intended outcome, but do reduce SNAP participation, especially among vulnerable groups, including those with no income, unhoused, and people living in rural areas. One of the participants of this research study, or one of the workers on the research study said, so essentially these work requirements harm people with no measurable benefit to the economy. So these are really important trade-offs to know about. Next slide. And like I mentioned, this isn't just hard for people who are applying or trying to keep their benefits. It's really hard for workers. This adds a lot of work to people's caseloads. They're already, woefully understaffed. A supervisor in Marin County told us, it's not the goal to discontinue people. The goal is to support them. We want to get you CalFresh. Help me help you. I don't want to discontinue you. I want to keep it supportive and keep you fed. And I share that quote, next slide, because in 2019, the administration at the time proposed a rule to expand work requirements. And so our team really set out to mitigate the harm from this proposed expansion. Next slide. We did a ton of user research in a bunch of different ways, including participatory design, doing client interviews, surveys, testing case outcomes, and testing different options for copy, all those things to try to understand how to make these really horrible rules a little bit easier for people to manage. Next slide. A lot of the questions that we had to ask were really invasive. So like, are you unhoused? Are you unable to work due to domestic violence? Are you unfit for work is the actual words in the rule. So really trying to humanize the language, make it person first whenever possible, and simplify things. So we were able to embed a standalone, an in-application screener for applicants on GetCalFresh.org, and then also a standalone ABOD screener, which we were set to launch in March of 2020. Next slide. And the idea was to make sure that we could get information that was, possible for clients to provide, get their story, because what we heard from workers during our research was that they needed all the context they could get. These rules were actually designed around an in-person process. When people were in an office, workers could talk to folks kind of more deeply, not over the phone where sometimes it's hard to hear or understand what's going on. And so this, again, was challenging for workers and for clients. So taking the information that we were able to get from clients, we were able to identify potential exemptions, support them in gathering documents, and then send this information to the counties. We also were planning to support counties in doing outreach or inreach to their applicants, anybody who was subject to the rule, to get this link, and they could fill all this out from their phone. Next slide. And so on the client side, you saw what that looked like, but on the worker side, we also do user-centered design for workers. So what do they need and how do they need this information to make their jobs as frictionless as possible? The most salient feedback we got was, please use the standard form. Please don't make up an extra form for us to have to figure out. And so we may use this standard form on the left that the state of California put together for all counties. And then we added just a little affidavit sheet because what we learned from workers was that they would want to see, in the client's words, like why weren't they able to work? And a signature and a date on that would help them just like keep it moving and make it as easy as possible to get through this backlog. Next slide. So this was probably the happiest we've ever been to throw a bunch of work away right when we were about to launch this process. A federal injunction stopped the expansion of work requirements in March of 2020. So we were really, really pleased. This was sort of irrespective of the pandemic, but through the pandemic, really held. Next slide. So you might be wondering, why are we bringing this up today? How is this relevant today? Unfortunately, it's hyper relevant today. The Farm Bill is set to be, figured out this year, probably likely going to get pushed back. But the conversation around work requirements is heating up again. Unfortunately, all of these headlines were pulled this week, just to give you a sense of like what we're dealing with. In fact, yesterday, Speaker McCarthy released legislation that would, among other things, expand work requirements for SNAP and add them to Medicaid in exchange for temporarily lifting the debt ceiling. Really, the goal here is to include this for older workers who are targeted by this expansion. So not just 18 to 49, but raising it for older folks too, who face the additional barrier of age discrimination in hiring. Building human-centered systems is critical, as we all know, but advocating for human-centered policy that removes barriers and enables access is critical as well. Next slide. And I'm going to hand it over to Ryan.
Thank you, Francesca, and thank you all for joining us on this journey today and spending parts of your day with us. At this point, we walk through 3 case studies of how we use computers and technology to simplify complex policy problems for clients. You can use gating and skip logic to make sure you're only asking the most critical questions. You can use clear, simple language and avoid jargon. And these are just some of the tools among many. You can regularly talk with clients to understand their pain points. And all of these interventions have major impact. They get more people benefits, they get more people to keep benefits, and they help mitigate really harmful policies. That said, they cannot be a substitute for creating policies and programs built for people's needs. We need to both deliver human-centered services and the technology that supports those services, while also fighting for a more human-centered policy and for programs in the first place that really center fighting poverty and getting people the benefits they need as the primary and main priority. On the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about how all of these different pieces fit together. So the ultimate goal here for Code for America, for all of the work we do in the safety net, for GetCalFresh, is to achieve systems change. We want to catalyze change with human-centered digital products and direct services that lead to really important outcomes for clients. Through GetCalFresh, we show it's possible to submit an application for a benefit that answers all the main questions and provides important critical information to caseworkers in just under 12 minutes. Building things like that or designing services with that in mind help create conditions for change. They frame problems and solutions, they build momentum, show that it's possible when it seems like it might not be. They also help us highlight client stories and client needs and highlight the ways that you can both meet those needs for clients and fit really important constraints that our government partners are working through. And so once you've delivered these services and you've been able to frame the problem and have evidence for what helps it change, that's when you start moving to enable government to do the same. We can sustain change by creating compatible solutions that work for workers, that address their problems of really intense workload, that fit within government constraints like security requirements. Really great conversation going on in the Q&A about that. And by building with capacity with government partners to think in this similar way, to talk to users, to iterate on what you're hearing and to keep building and continuously improving, to ultimately get policy programs that are human-centered and that really work to keep people on benefits. On the next slide, I'd love to pose a question to you all and keep this conversation going. How can you center people's needs in your day-to-day work? I hope this conversation inspired some ideas. Would definitely love to hear from you in the chat. And as always, the Q&A is open if you have questions.
While we get things in the chat, which thank you, Bedla, language access, this is a huge one for us and something we've really leaned into in the last few years. Really, one of the things that we found has been so effective is to everything that we do to disaggregate by language and really see like what is actionable within that. So knowing if a flow is not working for speakers of one particular language to be able to address that. And great. Awesome. Looking for advocacy. I think also we have some links that Annalise can drop in the chat for calls to action. If you're interested in following along on these policy conversations, we recommend signing up for email alerts from our friends at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. They do a really, really good job of synthesizing everything and they can keep you up to date. Also, the Food Research Action Center has a lot of great updates that you can follow along if you want to get more involved. The other thing that we recommend is, wherever you live, there's probably a food bank working nearby, or community-based organizations that are working to increase access to food and also to eliminate poverty. So we recommend that you find out what's going on locally as well. There was a great question from Karina. What kinds of policy advocacy has your team in Code for America done in this space? Are there any tactics that have been more successful than others? This is a great question. So one of the things that we do, I would say that's maybe, we have some limits on what we can do for advocacy given our contract, is to improve participation directly. We do have a associate director of policy who just started this year. We're really excited to have him, and he's thinking a lot about how to work through the Farm Bill conversations, how to introduce metrics that center people, really thinking about things that could be cost neutral given the context of this Farm Bill. The other kind of support that we provide is really through kind of like more administrative advocacy or proving out things. So being able to provide data and proof points to others working in the space, sharing client stories, I think can help just inform the conversation based on the fact that we have access to people's, real experiences with the program. And we can use those anonymous stories. And sometimes we also, like all the quotes that you saw today were, had consent to share publicly, but really in the service of making the program better. Do you link out to resources addressing some of the barriers, health, transportation, living from the application? How does this tie into the holistic safety net? I see Annalise is answering in the chat. This is such a great question. One of the things that we are trying to be really diligent about is making sure that we don't bog down folks with information while they're applying. Just because if their goal is to apply, we want to get them through the process. We do have some cross referrals that we do afterwards. And so if people consent to get follow-up text messages, we refer them to the Earned Income Tax Credit, which is also something we do at CFA, at Code for America, to PEBT referrals, all that great stuff. We have stopped short of adding additional benefits because of the new system, Benefits Cal, that launched in California and has rolled out for the past couple of years and is going to be fully rolled out by the end of this year. We really want to support that system and being the best it can be. So we are not adding additional benefits at this time to our website, although that is a huge goal of Code for America. And I think generally speaking, we aim to integrate benefits wherever possible. Oh, this is a great question, Mark. Hi, Mark. Because you're a private and independent org, does that allow you to have wording on GetCalFresh that doesn't require state approval? That's a really good question. So we are able to translate questions into plain language. And we do run things by CDSS if there's any question about whether or not it hits the nail on the head. One thing about CalFresh and SNAP that's different is that you can submit pretty basic minimal application and still get that starting the process. And so what we've done is, we don't submit minimal applications because those are really hard to process, hard to get approved. It's not like actually better for client experience. So, we do allow folks to submit them as per their legal requirements, but we don't encourage it through our design. But really what we do is try to get the right information to the workers at the right time. And then workers are able to kind of resolve any outstanding questions they may have based on what they have through the interview process. And this model really comes from community-based organizations. In fact, I worked at a community-based organization as GetCalFresh was starting and worked closely with the folks starting the website to let them know how I was asking questions. So like Ryan mentioned, asking for income is really hard. So we don't have to say gross income, that sort of thing. All of these things do get translated into the standard applications. Right now there are two, so Benefits Cal and CalWin, my Benefits CalWin. And so all of those things still match to specific questions. And that's based on policy knowledge, and that definitely gets approval when needed from CDSS. Those websites in turn can also do the same thing, and they have to map to a form called the SAWS 2+, which is the form that Ryan showed on screen. All right. Oh, Tiffany, this is a great question. The cynic in me believes that government keeps these systems complex to prevent people from participating. Did you find that this was the case in your work to reduce pain points and simplifying? If so, how did you push back? If not, what's the gap between government service providers and policymakers? I think I can guess, but would love your thoughts. Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of compromises that you see that start really at the Farm Bill. So again, the Farm Bill is like, well, I should define the Farm Bill. So it's basically every 4 to 5 years, a huge piece of legislation that basically funds the food security work, like SNAP, and then also subsidies for farms. So a lot goes into the Farm Bill. I like to think of it as the World Cup of food security and farming. It only comes every few years. You got to really gear up, and then you might be disappointed, I think, is kind of the long and short of it. But at that Farm Bill, we do see, I think, a tension between wanting to increase participation and not feeling like that's the best use of resources. So I think that is something that we feel downstream. And I think the further upstream we can work to resolve those issues, the better things will be. So I think that's kind of exactly what we were hoping to communicate today. So thank you, Tiffany. And there are also, of course, myriad public servants who are working to increase access to this. So I definitely don't want to discount that. Curious to see if folks had more ideas in the chat of how they're going to apply these concepts to their day-to-day work. Tailored questions. Thank you, Marianne. If there are any other questions, we're happy to take them live, or any feedback you have, drop it in the chat. I think we have a couple more slides to get through. All right, so you can keep in touch with us and follow along by going to codeforamerica.org/safety-net-partner, and that will sign you up for news alerts for our work. Next slide. And don't forget to join us at the 2023 Summit if you haven't planned to already. It will be May 16th to May 17th in Washington, D.C. And I'll go ahead and close us out unless there are any additional questions. Here are some ways you can follow us along online. Thank you, Kiana. So, thank you all again so much for spending your morning with us and for attending today's Find Your Summit webinar. Again, a reminder, the Code for America Summit is coming up next month, May 16th to 17th in Washington, D.C. We hope to see you all there. Kiana added the link to learn more about Summit in the chat. And then additionally, keep an eye out for more sessions like this in the Find Your Summit series. And there are other ways to find us online. I think we just ran through those. We really hope you enjoyed today's presentation, and we hope you have a wonderful day. I'm happy to stick around for any additional questions, but wanted to make sure you all had all these great ways you can keep up with us.